Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. And we're so pleased to have you here with us for a celebration of this new book, Menachem Kipnis, Yiddish Folklore and Photographs from Interwar Poland, for which we are very pleased to have with us the editor, Sheila Jelen, as well as the translator, Raphael Finkel. And moderating today's panel is Natan Meir. So I'm just going to read you their bios and then we'll jump in. Sheila Jelen is a professor in the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. Her scholarship is in the field of modern Jewish literature and culture, with a particular emphasis on gender and Jewish literacy and the intersection between ethnographic, photographic, and literary discourses in popular reconstructions of pre-Holocaust Eastern European Jewish life in Israel and the United States. She is the author of Salvage Poetics, Post-Holocaust American Jewish Folk Ethnographies, and Testimonial Montage, a family of Israeli Holocaust testimonies from the Krakow ghetto resistance. Raphael Finkel is a professor emeritus of computer science at the University of Kentucky. Finkel is an activist for the survival of the Yiddish language. He has built many online Yiddish facilities, including a Yiddish-English dictionary, a Yiddish typewriter, and a searchable and downloadable edition of the complete works of Sholem Aleichem, which I will say personally I have used among many of the resources that Raphael has created, and it is fantastic, a true contribution to all of us. And finally, Natan Meir is the Lori I. Loki Chair in Judaic Studies at Portland State University. He is the author of Kiev Jewish Metropolis, A History 1859 to 1914, and Stepchildren of the Shtetl, The Destitute, Disabled, and Mad of Jewish Eastern Europe, 1800 to 1939. He lectures widely on Jewish history and culture in Ukraine, Russia, Poland, and the Baltics, Jewish folklore and magic, and Jewish disability history. He is now working on a study of lived Judaism that explores the persistence of folk traditions and magical practices in the lives of ordinary Jews. So I want to just say one brief word before getting started, which is for those of you that don't know YIVO, we're a very special place for the celebration and contemplation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have an enormous archive and library, which are at the core of our institution, with over 23 million documents, photographs, and letters, and posters, and sound recordings, and so on and so forth. And this is used by researchers around the world. So this brings to life the world of Eastern European Jewish history and Jewish culture in a way that this book really contributes very much to what we're working on here at YIVO. And in addition to our collections and the research that we facilitate, we have public programs like this, we have classes, we have exhibitions. So with that, really delighted to be able to celebrate this new book. And I'm going to hand everything over to Natan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for a discussion of this very exciting new book, which is a true gem for those of us who are fascinated by both Jewish culture in Eastern Europe and by the very rich folklore that East European Jews created. I was really honored to be asked to moderate this event. I myself grew up with the Jews of Chelm, as my father read me stories from singers the Fools of Chelm, and names like Shmendrik Numskull, Zayn Volnini, Dopey Lekish, and of course Gronim Ox still resonate with me to this day, as I'm sure they do for some of you gathered with us today. I myself, as Alex mentioned, also do research on folklore, and I wrote the article on Kipnis, on Menachem Kipnis, for the YIVO Encyclopedia of Jews in Eastern Europe. And I used some of the images from the rotogravure section of the Forverts newspaper for my most recent book. So there's a lot of connections here for me with the book and with its material. I want to just remind everyone to please mute yourselves now. And we will have a Q&A moment at towards the end of our time today. So please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A function of Zoom. put them in there and not into the chat so that I can easily distinguish where the questions are. And I will be looking through those over the course of our time together today, and we'll come to the Q&A a bit later on. So we're going to start off with a short presentation from Sheila, and then we'll move on to a reading from Chelm. Sheila, please.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. I hope it works. Can everyone see my screen?
We're still
No?
waiting for it to load.
Oh. Okay, there's something going on with my power with my Zoom today. I don't know what.
We can see it now.
Okay. Now the question is whether I'll be able to navigate. Okay. You see a picture of the cover of the book now?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, great. So first of all, I want to thank the YIVO Institute not only for sponsoring this event, but for making the photographs in this book possible. The photographs in this book were mostly gleaned from their really amazing website, People of a Thousand Towns. And as I discuss in the book, th most of the images that appear in the book are from this website. However, I was encouraged by Vital Jaika to come into the archive and to look at the actual files, and I did find other photographs there that have not been digitized for the archive, for the online archive. And so it just was a really important learning experience for me to be able to work with YIVO. Thank you very much. And I wanted to just also thank Rutgers University Press, and particularly my editor, Sarah Nassim, who worked beautifully with me. I really enjoyed the collaboration. And then finally, and most importantly, I want to thank Raphael Finkel for doing these translations. As I think we'll describe maybe a little bit later, Rafi and I met at the University of Kentucky, and I joined his Yiddish reading group when I first got there, and he said, "What do you want to read?" And I said, "Oh, well, let's read some home stories." And that's in part where this project came from. So I want to thank Rafi for initiating that reading group and for agreeing to do these translations. So I wanted to actually say a few words about Menachem Kipnis, who is pictured here. Menachem Kipnis was first and foremost an ethnomusicologist, and that's part of where this book came from, was my interest in the fact that not only did he collect and perform ethnic Yiddish music, as he called it, but he also collected other things. And two of those things were Chelm stories and images of East European, visual images of East European Jews. And he simultaneously published the Chelm stories and the photographs in the Yiddish press, both in Europe and in the United States in the 1920s and the 1930s. And this book is a juxtaposition of the Chelm stories that he published in the Yiddish Warsaw paper Haynt, and the images of East European Jews in the Forverts in New York. And I was very interested in juxtaposing these two media in considering his contribution as a folklorist to our understanding of the interwar period. I don't, in the book, we don't really focus at all on the music. I mentioned it in the introduction, but in honor of Rafi, who is an amazing musician, and who taught my daughter Merav how to lane for her bat mitzvah in a way that she'll never forget. Um, I wanted to share a little bit about just a little song that is from his book Volkslieder, which was published in 1918. The song is probably familiar to those of you who know Yiddish music. It's called Margaritkele, and it was shared with me by my colleague here at the University of Chicago, who is an ethnomusicologist named Philip Bowman. I don't know if he's in the audience because I haven't looked at the attendees, but um, he he is the music director of the New Budapest Orpheum Society, and they did an album called Cabaret in Exile, where they featured three of the songs um, from Volkslieder, which is Kipnis's one of Kipnis's two books of folk songs that he published during his life. And I thought we could start just by hearing a little bit of it. So, Alex, if you're able to play some of that song, I'd be grateful.
Yep, I just need to stop your sharing.
Okay.
Um,
In Wäldern beim Teichen und Seen gewachsen, Margaretelech elend und klein. Wie Kleininke Sonnen mit Weißinke Strahlen, mit Weißinke Tralala. Wie Kleininke Sonnen mit Weißinke Strahlen, mit Weißinke Tralala. Gegangen ist Halvele still und verholend, zu losen die goldblonde Zweig. Das Hölzelen bläust und gemurmelt, gesungen ein Liedle, tralala. Das Hölzelen bläust und gemurmelt, gesungen ein Liedle, tralala. Die Sonne ist vergangen, der Bucher verschwunden und Havela sitzt noch im Wald. Sie guckt in der Weiten und murmelt verhohnt das Liedle tralala. Sie guckt in der Weiten und murmelt verhohnt das Liedle tralala.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share again if I can. Let's see. Can you see? Are we back in my PowerPoint? Yeah. Okay. So the singer was Julia Bentley. The pianist was Ilya Levinson. The setting was made by Victor Ullman. And the song is from Kipnis's book Volkslieder from 1918. And I wanted to actually, one of the beauties of teaching and researching is, sometimes you look at your own work and you discover new things even after it's been published. So while I was thinking about what we were going to talk about today, I thought, oh, I'll pick out some photographs that are interesting for people to look at if they haven't yet acquired the book. And I realized that a lot of his pictures, a lot of the photographs he took were of musicians, which really brings together his ethnomusicological work with the work of collecting folk literature and taking photographs. So I wanted to just share a few of the more interesting examples of this. So here you see a picture from the book, and it's a man singing on a railroad track. And the caption is Moshe Kusavitsky, Warsaw's chief cantor from the Tlamatsker synagogue, tests his voice standing on the train line from Atwak, a resort town near Warsaw. So that's just one example. And I didn't honestly like this. I discovered this trend in his book 20 minutes ago. I spent years working on picking out the photographs and figuring out where to put them. And I didn't even notice this until I started thinking about music. Another example, there's a woman looking out the window, two people on a cart right outside, and the caption is this is from Ushitsa, Ukraine, 1925, and you'll notice that there's a caption listed in English and in Yiddish, and we can talk more about that later. But outside a cottage with a thatched roof, two men in traditional dress pose in a horse-drawn wagon. The woman posing in the window is the mother of a well-known cantor, Mordechai Hirschman, who served in Vilna in the United States. And then the Yiddish, which is quite a different caption, says, if you don't have a Ford, then a Ferd will do. Joke the Jewish merchants of the Ukrainian village. So, again, in the postscript to the book, I talk about some of the differences between the Yiddish and the English captions, which appeared in the Forverts. We won't do that now, but again, another image drawn from the arsenal of music. Here's a picture of a street harpist and a picture of a man with this lovely phonograph baby buggy contraption where he goes around and plays music on the streets. This is an example of a photograph of someone as it appears in the paper, an itinerant cobbler in the Forverts, and this is a picture of a spread from the Forverts, Jewish Life in Poland, which is where a lot of the photographs that he sent ended up in these kinds of spreads that Natan mentioned earlier. And just a few more photographs that I thought would be nice to look at. These are just some of the ones that appear in the book alongside the stories. These are flappers in putting on lipstick in Warsaw. A woman selling herring. These are famous actors, which again brings us into the realm of music, and I can't remember their names, and I can't find the oh, here it is. They are Jacob Fisher and S. Ratner, famous Yiddish actors. So I just wanted to start by bringing together the three elements, the music, the photographs, and the stories through this visual representation. I'm going to stop the share now and turn things over to Rafi.
I would like to read a little bit of the translations. And while I'm doing that, maybe you can follow it in the Yiddish here. So here's the one I'm going to read my translation of. I'm not a professional translator, but you have to know how to speak to a rabbi. Three Chelmer Jews were walking on Tisha B'Av in the marketplace. One was sick, the second was old, and the third suffered from a hernia. Because they were suffering from the fast, they decided to go to the rabbi's study to get permission to eat. The sick one went in first. Rabbi, he said, I'm sick. May I eat? If you're sick, you may eat, the rabbi answered, but don't be insolent. You should know how to speak to a rabbi. When you tell a rabbi that you're sick, you should add, Lo Aleichem, it shouldn't happen to you. When he came out, the old Jew asked him what the rabbi had said. He recounted to him that he had told him to eat, but you have to know how to speak to a rabbi. How then? Well, when you tell something to the rabbi, you should add, it shouldn't happen to you. The old Jew went into the rabbi's study and asked, Rabbi, it shouldn't happen to you, old. May I eat? If you're old and can't manage the fast, you may eat, but don't be insolent. When you tell a rabbi that you're old, you don't say, Lo aleichem, it shouldn't happen to you. You say, Aleichem v'al benechem. You say, may it be upon you and your children. Well, the old Jew went out. The one with a hernia asked him what the rabbi had said. He recounted to him that he told him to eat, but he had upbraided him that he didn't know how to speak with a rabbi. Well, how should you speak then? When you speak with a rabbi, you should say, Aleichem v'al benechem. May it be upon you and your children. The man with a hernia went in and asked, Rabbi, I suffer. May it be upon you and your children from a hernia. May I eat? So I'll just add that the translations are full of footnotes that Sheila has put in, very academic sort of footnotes. And the footnote for this one says, one of the common mistakes Chelmites make is failing to understand linguistic cues and concretizing metaphoric idioms. And then this also is a main theme of Gimple Tom by Bishevis, which Sheila also points out. So not only do you get the stories translated into Yiddish, and of course all the pictures into English and all the pictures, but you get a lot of very interesting footnotes, which are highly worth reading. And I must thank Sheila for this, and of course Yivo for sponsoring this event, and Natan for being here as well and interviewing us.
Well, this is not only my pleasure, but it's also it's a rare treat for me to read a book that I get requested to read in an academic setting and to be laughing out loud in my office as I read it. I would like to ask the two of you a little bit more, if you could tell us a little bit more about how this book came about. I know, Sheila, you mentioned that you and Raphael had studied Yiddish together in Kentucky, but this is I don't know if it's so an unusual collaboration, but it certainly is it certainly feels bashert in some way for this to have come about, and I'm sure those who have gathered here today would love to hear a little bit about your journey to creating the book.
Well, I can start by saying it, about 17 years ago, I was researching up an earlier book of mine called Salvage Poetics. And I was in the YIVO archive for the first time in my life. And I was poring over these Forverts pages with these images of photographs. And I was writing a chapter for my book on Roman Vishniak and Alter Katzizna, who were two other important photographers whose images appeared in the Forverts. And someone came out to me from the archive and said to me, "Oh, you're interested in these photographs, are you?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, do you know about Menachem Kipnis's photographs?" And I said, "No." And he said, "We have boxes and boxes of Menachem Kipnis's photographs." And he said, Menachem Kipnis had no children and he died in the Warsaw Ghetto and no one has done anything, no one has collected them. So in contrast to Roman Vishniak, who collected his own photographs, and Alter Katzizna, whose daughter, Shulamit Real Katzizna, worked with Marek Webb, who was the archivist at YIVO for a long time. They had, books printed of their photographs, and I think it might have been Mark Webb who came out and talked to me, actually. I'm not 100% sure who it was. But I said, you know what? I'll do it, but not right now. I'll do it when I have time. And it was always in my mind, this challenge to me, to not just do this kind of abstract scholarly work, but to actually kind of preserve someone's legacy. And so I think that's what I was thinking of when Rafi and I started, thinking about what we wanted to read together. And it occurred to me that, oh, I think what happened was that maybe Rafi, you have to remind me. I said, let's read some Chelm stories, and you found out that it was Menachem Kipnis who had done this collection in Yiddish. And I said, oh, really? Menachem Kipnis? I can't remember exactly how it happened, but somehow it all came together.
Well, I can add a little bit of the story. Starting in 2018, where in the fall semester was Sheila's first semester at the University of Kentucky. And we were in touch a little bit before then as well. And already Sheila was expressing interest in reading some Yiddish together. And actually, it was Sheila's suggestion that we read the Chelm stories from Menachem Kipnis. So I found it online. It's one of the many books that have been digitized at the Yiddish Book Center, and it's available online. In fact, the copy that I was just sharing with the group here, I just picked up from the online one today. So it's available even today. And so I was teaching at that point every fall for the University of Kentucky a course in Yiddish, a first course in Yiddish. And that particular semester, one person signed up for it and quickly dropped it. And so we decided, well, we've got a time, we've got a room, let's meet. And so several of us met. It was Sheila and I and Karen Patron, who is on the faculty at the university. Her specialty is Russian history of the 20th century. And so it was good. Someone who can speak Russian, someone who has a background in both Hebrew and Yiddish, and me. And so we decided we would start by reading the Chelm stories. And since then, the group has expanded somewhat, and it's now available. After COVID, it became only on Zoom. And so there are people now who still are this part of this group. We meet once a week. We've read very difficult material. We've read Edge's Nakoma by Chava Rosenfarb. I think I've got the name right. We read Mein Krieg mit Herschel Rasseiner by Chaim Grade. Very difficult. And now we decided to do something really easy. So we're reading Mein Volk, a grammar school book about the history of the Jewish people in Yiddish. But so there is such a group, and we still are meeting. So Sheila was in at the very beginning.
Thank you. That is really interesting. It's always fascinating to hear some of the backstory behind how a book comes about. So you've already told us that this book brings together the stories that Kipnis collected and his photographs. And I'm very intrigued by the juxtaposition of these two. The stories were published first in Haynt, in the Warsaw Yiddish daily newspaper, and then in book form. And this book is a translation of that book. The photographs, as you mentioned, were published in the Forverts in New York. And so I'd love to hear you reflect on how these two very different types of ethnographic artifacts, and each one has its own audience, really, how they reflect the trajectory and also the genius, I think, of Kipnis's own career as a folklorist or an ethnographer, however we want to put it, and his broader work.
Yes, thank you. Um, so Itzhak Gottesman, in his book, I think it's called The Birth of a Yiddish Nation, he he gives a history of the Polish Jewish folklore movement. Um, and it's actually I write a little bit about it in the introduction to this book. I was doing something complicated in that I was representing two very different contexts, with the film stories being published in Warsaw and the photographs being published in New York. Um, the there were a lot of different movements going on across the Jewish world in the 1920s and the 1930s in terms of trying to create different variations on a Jewish nation. There was a movement away from the dogmas of religious tradition, and there was an attempt to, instead of assimilating, there was an attempt to somehow regroup, right? What defined Jewishness? What defined a Jewish nation? And so we all know the story about, the Bund versus Zionism, the question of are we a Jewish nation here, or do we have to be a Jewish nation somewhere else? Are we delimited by which language are we delimited by? Yiddish, Hebrew. And so by looking at the work of Menachem Kipnis as an ethnographer, in these three different forms: music, photography, and Chelm stories, and also in these different places, the United States and Poland, we see just in one man's corpus so many different faces of this interwar folklore movement. Um, so in my introduction, I talk about two different posts. I talk about a post-European discourse that's going on in the United States, and then a post-shtetl discourse that's going on in Poland at the same time, basically. Um, and the post-shtetl discussion really is an answer to the question of, why did these Chelm stories become so wildly popular in the Warsaw Yiddish press? Why were, according to some historians, why were mothers of daughters from Chelm writing in panic to the editor saying, "Stop publishing these stories, my daughter's not going to get a shit out." Why was everyone reading them? Why did everyone love them so much? And I conjecture that they created a kind of distance. In understanding modern Jewish history, there's a lot of foreshortening. So I'll give an example. When you think about generations of Hebrew and Yiddish writers, there's the father, there's the Zayde, and then the Tate, and then there's the child, right? But the Zayde, the Tate, and the child are all basically in the same generation, right? Things move very quickly, and so one could say, well, the urban Jews in Warsaw reading Haynt were very, very many steps removed from the shtetl, and so they were looking back fondly. But I don't think that's quite the case. I think that stories like the Chelm stories that they were so fond of were actually creating that distance. They were looking for something to separate them from that legacy of the shtetl. And these stories help them say, well, that's not me. That's funny, and it's not me. And in America, too, in terms of post-European, many, of the Forverts readers were either first generation immigrants, or, the reason they had English and Yiddish captions in the art section was maybe second generation immigrants were also flipping through it and weren't as deeply acquainted with the Yiddish, and so they needed the captions in English. But in any case, there were these people who were just a step away from Europe. And according to Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimlet, who wrote an introduction to this rotogravure section in the Forverts where these photographs appeared, claims that people used that section to look and say, "Oh, thank God that's not how I live anymore." It created this kind of distance between Europe, the old world, and the new world. So, I think that's the genius of Kipnis, is that he, if you bring his different pieces together, it gives you a kind of arc, a panoply of the many different experiences of Jews during that period, both in Europe and in the United States.
And How do you think, given what you just said about American Jews in the interwar period, looking at these photographs and, in a sense, seeing in them the distance, not only the geographical distance, but also in some ways the metaphysical distance, if you like, between them and the Jews of Eastern Europe. Um, and this is actually a question really for both of you. What purpose can the stories or should the stories serve today? Because obviously, those of us who study folklore, ethnographic artifacts as part of our, part of our research, we're going to approach them in one way. But I would guess that most of the people on this webinar are not doing that kind of academic research and are still interested in these stories. And I'm curious as to what value do they present today to Jews, specifically American Jews, or perhaps Jews anywhere?
Well, I can give you several possible answers. One is it gives you something of a viewpoint, although a stilted viewpoint, into the daily life of people in the shtetl, because these stories are all set in a shtetl. And you see such things as a shamus and the agricultural component of life there, and things like that. So you see something about life that in a place that no longer exists in a time that's fairly distant now. Also, these are fun stories. You can read them to your kids and they'll understand it, because these are, as you say, you grew up with them, Natan, stories that Bashevis had put together. So yeah, these are fun just to read through and enjoy for their own sake. As far as those who can read it in the original, it gives you some flavor of Yiddish expressions, because a lot of it is dialogue, and you can get some feeling for how dialogue works in Yiddish, which you don't get so much out of reading some other literature. So it's got various advantages for the modern person, even though it's only a small section of our vast Yiddish and other Jewish literature.
I would just add that one thing that I document in the book is the way that the Chelm stories traveled to America and changed in America. I point out that in the original, not in the original, I mean, there's no such thing as an original folklore, original story, but in the ones that are published by Kipnis and Haynt, and then subsequently in the 1930 volume, no one has a name. Everyone is just a type. There's, the Rebbe and the Shamus, as Rafi pointed out, and there's an old woman and, whatever. So, but when it moves to America, and in fact, one little interesting tidbit is that there was a book published in 1929 that was based on these stories that even came out before Kipnis's own collection. In America, it came out. And so when they come to America, oftentimes they are expanded and the characters are named and they become much more literary than they were in the original. And something that I've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about is how Americans in particular kind of conflate fiction with fact, when they're trying to find a way to reconstruct pre-Holocaust East European Jewish life. And so, it's really like the Fiddler on the Roof effect, which is, Fiddler on the Roof is a collection of short stories written by Shalom Aleichem. And in fact, he himself can't keep the details straight. In some stories, there's 5 daughters. In some stories, there's 7 daughters, it's clearly fiction. And yet, many, many, many Americans see that as a window into a lost world, not just in a kind of charming and entertaining way, but like really, you know. And so it's interesting to me to think a little bit about how this expansion, naming, sort of dramatizing a little bit more, making it more relatable, as my students like to say, um, allows Americans to say, oh, you know, I really am getting a glimpse into the shtetl in a way that is kind of devoid of a deep awareness of how very fictional even the notion of a shtetl as it's represented in literature really is.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. There was a note in the Q&A. I think a couple actually of folks asked if you could provide a little bit more about Kipnis's own biography, just maybe just in a few sentences to give us a sense of kind of where he came from and how he got to this ethnographic career.
Rafi, you want me to do that one?
Yes, yeah, you're the expert on the biography. The book itself, in the introduction at the very beginning, does have a bit of biographical information indicating that Kipnis was born in Ushamir, which is in a place now Ukraine, and musical career and so on. But I'll let Sheila answer the question.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I can just read that first paragraph of the book, I think. It'll probably give a good sense of what you're asking. So as Rafi started us off with, he was born in Ushamir of what is now Ukraine into a family of cantors. He was orphaned as a young child, and he distinguished himself as a talented musical performer when, at 8 years of age, he followed his older brother to Chernobyl and joined a synagogue choir. By the age of 18, he was accompanying several cantors around Poland, Ukraine, and Lithuania as a soloist. And by 20, he had become first tenor in the chorus of the Warsaw National Opera. He occupied this position for 16 years. Much of his adult life was spent traveling around Poland performing folk songs with his wife, Zimra Zeligfeld. And when Kipnis teamed up with the younger Zeligfeld to perform Yiddish folk songs, Itzik Gottesman writes, quote, they were among the most popular entertainment acts in Poland. The most widely sung Yiddish songs today can be traced back to Kipnis's performance or publications of them. So he was in his moment, he was best known for his music and for his performances. He died of a stroke in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942. And I write in the introduction that Emanuel Ringelblum, who headed off the Oynik Shabbos archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, asked Zeligfeld, Zimra, Kipnis's wife, to donate his stuff to the Oynik Shabbos archive. And she was hesitant because she wanted to publish it after the war, and she didn't know what would happen to it if she gave it all over to Emanuel Ringelblum. And unfortunately, she was killed at Treblinka, and all we have of his oeuvre really is what was published and what was sent abroad to New York.
Yeah, obviously one of innumerable tragic losses, not only in terms of human lives, but of Jewish culture. There was a question in the Q&A for those looking for Chelm stories in the original Yiddish to share with children. Do you know of any collections in Yiddish which include illustrations? And if not, which version would you recommend as the most comprehensive collection of Chelm stories in the Yiddish? I think you wrote in the book that this collection is the largest ones, 90 odd Chelm stories in Yiddish, right? And that's available for free on the website of the Yiddish Book Center. I think that's the one you were sharing with us before, Raphael, in the
Yes.
Yiddish.
I'm just looking through to see if there are any pictures. To share with children, the level of Yiddish is not difficult. There are a few unusual words, but generally it's not difficult. There are It's not an illustrated text. There are little graphics here and there, but not illustrations.
And also Miriam Udell, who's a professor at um,
Emory.
Emory, I think, at Emory. She's done a lot of work, excuse me, in recent years on children's literature in Yiddish. So I don't know offhand of any Yiddish collections with illustrations, but if you look at Miriam Udell's work, or if you even just write to her, I'm sure she would have an answer to that question.
Yes, that's true that Miriam Udell, if I understand correctly, most of her output has been translated into English from Yiddish, but of course she will know about collections for children in Yiddish. There's a question about the kind of precursors or the prehistory of the Chelm stories. Um, and Diane Wolfthal asks, Isaac Mayer Dick, who is an important Yiddish writer of the 19th century, mentions the fools of Chelm in his 19th century story, the Orchim in Durachishok. And Durachishok is basically like Stupid Town. Was Kipnis influenced by his work?
Yeah, so there's an important book on the Chelm stories called well, the author is Ruth von Bernuth, and the book is, I think, called How the Wise Men Got to Chelm. And I have it on my shelf, but I think that's the title. And she traces the legacy of Chelm stories to an early modern German source called Das Schildberger Buch, which was first published in 1598. Um, and it's it's a city of fools set in Germany. And I think that and there are a few writers like Dieck, who you mentioned, who I think were working with this oral tradition that supposedly originated with Das Schildberger Buch, although I do have a student right now at the University of Chicago who's working on um he's basically arguing against that, that the Cham stories really are directly from that German tradition. He's arguing that it has its own unique, very unique Jewish qualities that we can't we can't push aside. But I I think that for sure it was folklore, right? So it was in circulation, and Deke was writing it, and Kipnis started collecting it, right? Collecting the stories, and he frames the ones that appear in the newspaper as him being a correspondent who's visiting the city of Chelm and who's getting the stories and then reporting on them in the newspaper. So with each presentation of these stories, it changes a little bit in its framing. But yes, it comes from the same source, which is these stories that are circulating.
One of the things that I found fascinating about the Kipnis presentation, which is obviously reflected in your translation, is that it's mostly, it seems to me, folklore as art, but then there's also some interpolations which you point out, Sheila, in your footnotes, where he kind of comes into the text and says, this is one variation of the story, and then there's another variation as well, which is really Kipnis as kind of professional folklorist who's explaining that there are different variants on these stories. And that I found just a kind of fascinating aspect to the work itself.
Yeah, and he's inconsistent about it. You know, sometimes you'll be reading the book and you'll see that on page 20, for example, there's a story, and then on page 75, there's another version of that story, and he hasn't pointed out that it's just a variation on the one that came before.
Mhm.
Whereas sometimes he'll have the story and then he'll put this little insert, and here's another variant, and then another story. So it's kind of inconsistent. And it makes you wonder, did he not have a good editor, or was there some art to that too, to that very inconsistency? Yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting.
There was a question about the song that you played at the very beginning, Margaritkala. And someone asks, Jonathan Glickson asks, is the musical setting of the song one of three Yiddish songs that Ullmann composed in Theresienstadt
Yes.
in 1942?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, that was correctly guessed.
Thanks, John.
I guess you know the questioner. Um, uh, we have a few minutes left, and I've been wanting to ask you, Raphael. You said at the outset that you are not a professional translator, and this is a big translation job to take on, and it's beautifully done. And I wanted to ask you what it was like to immerse yourself in these stories for so long, and if you can tell us anything about the sense that you got of Kipnis's style in Yiddish. Just curious about that experience for you.
Sure. Yeah, it's not the only time I've been asked to do some translation. Um, but the Kipnis in particular, there was a certain amount of repetitiveness because the stories have a particular form. There's a problem, it's identified. There's a meeting held either for 3 nights and days and nights, or maybe for 7. And then it comes to a decision, and this is the decision. And you're wondering what could possibly go wrong. That is, how is the story going to make it so that the decision is a foolish decision, which is not going to work? And very likely, after that decision and it doesn't work, they'll go back and meet again and try to fix the problem they've just introduced. So there's a lot of repetitiveness. And in translating, I tried to use the same words in English every time the words came out in Yiddish. So they had a meeting. So am I going to say a meeting? I'm going to say an assembly. I kept track of what I had used so that I could try to be consistent, because the stories are consistent. And it was decided that the Yiddish for "it was decided" is "es ist geblieben," it remained. But English doesn't work that way. So every time it was decided that. Um, uh, "Azoi hat man getan," and that's just what they did. Often exactly that phrase. So as I was doing the translation, I was being careful that way. Also, there's a significant amount of Jewish specific vocabulary, shamus, yontif, rebbe, uh, things like that. And it was always a question, do I translate that? Do I leave the original? Do I put in the original with a comment? And in most of those cases, these words ended up in the glossary. So at the end of the book, there is a glossary for the technical terms which are not defined in the flowing text itself. Although I think as I was doing the translation, at least the first time I came across such a word like shamus. How are you going to translate shamus? It's not quite the same as sexton, although that's as close as you can get in English. And when you get to gabai, what's a gabai? The meaning has changed over time. In the time of the Talmud, the gabai was the charity collector. And these days, the gabai is the one who checks your Torah reading. But in these books, the gabai is something like a synagogue trustee. So it's um, the technical terminology. I tried to be consistent and tried to be consistent in how I chose to use the original terminology or to give an English translation.
Fantastic. We have some wonderful information coming through in the chat. References to books that have been mentioned in our conversation, and a link that Julia of Yivo just posted that will guide you to purchase the book, which we encourage you to do because it is wonderful in many ways and appeals to many senses. Um, it's yeah, we can just see it now, Raphael. It's a little bit difficult because of the blurring effect of Zoom, but
Right.
it's hard to get it in focus.
Right.
Uh, I guess maybe our last question will be, do you have any recommendations or how can we find collections of Chelm stories in English for children? I mentioned earlier Bashevis's, Isaac Bashevis Singer's collection, I think it's called the Fools of Chelm. And I know there's some other collections as well. Are there any that you two I mean, the truth is, I would recommend this one because I'm going to read these to my son. They're so funny, and and as Raphael said, they do bring East European Jewish culture to life. It's not a mimetic representation, obviously, as Sheila was pointing out earlier. We're seeing it through a glass darkly, if you like, but there are elements of shtetl life that are certainly accurate in the stories. Any recommendations for others besides this one?
I mean, I can only speak to the ones that were published, so there's Simon's Wise Men of Chelm from 1945, and there's Singer's Fools of Chelm, which came out in 1973, and there's Nathan Asobel's A Treasury of Jewish Folklore, which came out in 1948. Jacob Richman published a book called Jewish Wit and Wisdom in 1952. There were other collections of Chelm stories in Poland, but they weren't published they were published in academic context, not really in uh, popular context. Um, I mean, there are a lot of children's books that just take one story and illustrate it and publish it. You can probably find out from, what's the name of that Jewish children's book reading thing? I'm forgetting right now, where
A
they,
podcast?
no, it's
Oh,
they put a
PJ Library.
PJ Library. Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you. Yeah, PJ Library, I think, has a few picture books that are based on single Chelm
yeah,
stories.
that's right.
I can't think of any titles off the top of my head, but if you go on their website, you can probably find PJ Library. You can probably find a few from there.
Mhm. The very last question that I'll choose that I see in the Q&A is a brief one. Were there specific? I mean, we know that the photos that Kipnis sent to the Forverts showed up in particular issues, and those have dates. Are the photos themselves ever dated? Because you've looked at the original, Sheila.
Yeah, so some of them are dated. I mean, it was really interesting to look at the original because there are it's like a palimpsest of comments on the back of each photo with his own handwriting sometimes, Kipnis's own handwriting, and then the editor of the Forverts handwriting, and then a YIVO archivist's handwriting. Um, some of them are dated. I tried to provide dates for whatever was available in the book. I basically reproduced what I could get from the digital archive, and if that wasn't dated, I tried to look on the back of the photos. But
Mhm.
generally, the digital archive is as comprehensive as it gets. Some of it is simply illegible because of all of the layers. Without, special technology that I wasn't using.
Yeah.
But yes, there are some dates, but not all of them are dated.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we've just about reached the end of our time. So I want to thank both of you again, Sheila and Raphael, for giving us this wonderful book. And I encourage everyone to buy it, both for the stories and for the photographs and for the scholarly framework that surrounds it, which is really, really fascinating. Um, and if you read some Yiddish, you can then read it alongside the original, which is also fun to do. So thank you everyone who joined us today for being with us. I'm sure there are plenty more YIVO events for you to check out on the YIVO website. And Wishing everyone, wherever you are, a pleasant rest of your day or your evening.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you to Natan and to Rafi and to Yivo, Alex, everyone who organized this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks everyone.